What's up, everyone?
Hey guys.
Welcome to another Travel Therapy Mentor video. Tonight we're going to be talking about contracts, understanding contracts, some of the items that are often in contracts. This is something we've gotten a lot of questions on recently. There's a lot more travelers getting contracts now, and we will have people send us contracts occasionally if there's things they're not sure about or they just want us to look over it to make sure it looks good. And so it's kind of a good time to recover this topic and talk about what all is in different contracts and what you should look for. So Whitney's going to introduce us, and I'm going to get this video shared in a couple different groups.
Hi everybody. Thank y'all for joining us tonight, whether you're listening live or you're listening later on the replay. My name is Whitney Aiken.
I'm Jared Kazazza.
And we are both traveling doctors of physical therapy. Many of you guys may have tuned in the past for our weekly travel therapy videos. Every week on Facebook Live, we record a different video about a different travel therapy topic. We've been doing these videos for almost 2 whole years now, so we've covered a ton of topics. Our topic tonight we actually have covered in the past, but it's been well over a year since we covered it, so we wanted to cover it again for you guys that might be newer to travel therapy or haven't heard this topic before. We also have an article from a while back that we've written on this topic, so if you want to go back and read that article, it's at our website, traveltherapymentor.com, if you'd prefer to kind of hear this content or see it in written format. So as you mentioned, we're going to talk tonight about understanding what is in a written contract. A lot of when we get started with negotiating a travel therapy contract is in a verbal format or kind of back and forth via email. So we want to talk more formally about what you're going to see in your actual written contract, what to look out for, and what things that you need to kind of ask for if you don't see them there. So Jared is getting our video shared in a couple of groups so that more people can join on with us live on Facebook. And then as soon as he gets done with that, we will jump into tonight's topic. So I'll just give a shout out to those of you guys that are tuning in live. If you are watching live on Facebook, we would love if you would just give this video a thumbs up. If you would comment below and let us know that you're watching. Let us know who you are. Are you a current therapist who is traveling? Are you a therapist who's thinking about getting into travel therapy? Are you a student who's studying to become a therapist and thinking about doing travel therapy? We would love to hear from you and let us know kind of where you're at in this whole process. I know that Jeff is on, and Jeff is a current travel therapist, so he probably already knows this information, but it's always good to learn a little bit deeper for future contracts. Hey Armand. Armand is also a current travel therapist. Thank you for joining, Armand. Hi Nick. Hi Kimberly. Thanks guys for joining. And if you are watching later on the replay, feel free to just type in the Facebook comments #replay. I know a lot of you guys also will watch later on our YouTube channel or listen later on our podcast. If you do listen in those formats, we would love if you would subscribe to our YouTube channel or subscribe to our podcast so that you can make sure to get notified every week when we come out with a new video and then upload it to those formats. So again, thank you for joining us, and we'll dive into tonight's topic.
Yeah, so like I mentioned in the beginning, every company kind of approaches how they write out contracts differently. Some will have various things in there that others may not have. Some are very simplistic, some are extremely detailed. And that depends a lot on the company and the legal advice and guidance that the company has gotten, as well as feedback from travelers and things like that over the years to try to make things as understandable and as reasonable as possible. So the first thing that almost every contract is going to have at the top are the start and end dates. So, when are you expected to be there? What dates or how long are you going to stay? So that needs to be something that you've already talked about, obviously, with both the recruiter and the hiring manager, but that's going to be the first thing to look for and make sure that's correct.
Yeah, and so most of these things like your start and end dates and your pay and that sort of thing, you will have already discussed with your recruiter before you actually ever see the written contract. And this is a key point that I want to bring up for you guys that are just getting started in your travel therapy careers. Pretty much the recruiters are almost always going to consider when you accept an offer verbally, they're going to take that as an actual acceptance and commitment. Now, it's not really set in stone for sure until you actually sign the written contract, but it's pretty much 99% sure if you're going back and forth and discussing a contract with the recruiter and you verbally say, yes, I am going to take this contract, they pretty much take that as set in stone. If you then go back on your word and change something because you found a better offer or you just changed your mind, it's probably going to look pretty bad and sort of taint your relationship with that recruiter. So if you verbally accept something, understand that in the travel world, they usually take that as kind of a go ahead. So in the beginning, when you're going back and forth and you're talking with your recruiter, negotiating, they might send you an email with a general breakdown of your pay, and they might say verbally over the phone, okay, this is what your weekly pay is going to be, and generally, this is the location, and these are your start and end dates. So you will have probably already verbally agreed to these things, so you want to at least know before you ever see the written contract those basic things like start and end dates, roughly what is my pay package going to be every week after taxes, and obviously knowing the location and having hashed out the details of your schedule. So once you actually go and see the written contract, this is where you really want to make sure to check that everything that they said verbally is written correctly in the contract. And then we're going to go into more details about other things that are in there that you may or may not have even talked about yet.
Yeah, that's a good point. So you don't want to be the person that agrees to something, everything's fine, and then you go back on your word. You wouldn't want the recruiter or the company, the facility, to do that to you. So yes, try to be, obviously things happen. And if there's a situation where something changes and you're not able to follow through, that's a little different. But if it's just because of a different offer or, something like that, once you agree to a contract verbally, then, you should consider that as accepted, just like you would if you signed it, the written contract.
Yeah. Now, if you get the written contract and there's something that's a little bit off, they can tweak the fine details. If it's not exactly what you said or exactly what you thought, they can tweak that. But don't suddenly get the written contract and just say, nah, never mind, I'm not going to take this job. You don't want to go back and change anything dramatically, but if it's just a small detail that they missed or the pay was just slightly off, we can tweak things there after you see the written contract.
Yeah, and for the most part, you should also, when you verbally accept a contract, you should have already talked about pay at that point and agreed upon the pay rate, so things like hourly pay, stipends, reimbursements, all that, so that when you get the contract, you're just signing it and making it more official. But all that should have been discussed beforehand.
Mm-hmm. There shouldn't be any really big surprises when you get the written contract. So here's some things that you'll see when you get a written contract. Obvious things like your name, sometimes your address will be on there. You want to make sure those things are legally correct on there. Your name spelling correct is correct, and your address if they do that. You want to also see the name and the address of the facility and make sure that they have that correct, because every now and then there will be some facilities that will have different buildings or different locations, and you want to make sure that you understand exactly where it is you're going and that it's the place that you agreed to go to. And if it's not, if it says something like their corporate headquarters, just follow up and say, hey, I thought that you said I was going to be working at this location. Why does it say this? And they might say, oh, well, that's just, that's the headquarters, but you are going to be at this other site. And just make sure that that's understood before you sign. But it's not the end of the world if they say, legally we have to put this and that on there. And we'll get into talking about that too, where sometimes there will be some differences on what it actually says versus what you discussed. But we'll get into that in a little while.
And if anything is vague or you're uncertain about anything on a contract, always reach out to the recruiter and double check. I mean, it's never a bad thing to verify things before you sign it.
Yep. So your name, your contact information, the name and the address of the facility, correct start and end dates. So this is really important. We actually met a traveler one time that was ill-informed or just didn't really check to see that the correct dates were on his contract, and he thought he was working until this date, and then on his contract turns out he was only working until this date, and he ended up having to leave the contract like 2 weeks earlier than he thought, just because of kind of what was written on the contract. And he didn't realize this until right up to the end, and I think he actually worked 2 days over what they thought it was supposed to be. It was a whole big thing.
It was a weird situation, and normally that kind of thing doesn't happen, but always check to make sure those dates are right.
Yep. So don't let that be you. Make sure it's exactly what you discussed, exactly what you want it to be. With that said, you also want to make sure you have the correct dates, that if you've requested any days off. Really important that you've asked in advance for dates off, especially if it's something like for a holiday or a wedding or something specific you need off for. You really want to discuss that beforehand and have it written into the contract.
Yes, that's very important. And ideally, if you are very serious about a contract, after you talk to the hiring manager, talk to them about things like days you might need off, and make sure that they also understand that in addition to it being written in the contract. Because we had a situation where Whitney, in the contract, she had days written in that she needed off, and then the hiring manager, when it came up to that time for her to have those days off, was like, oh, I had no idea about this, because they didn't read the contract very well. And you just want to try to avoid those things if possible, because it just causes additional friction. So just make sure all parties involved are informed on all those things.
Yeah, that's really important, because sometimes you may have agreed to something with your recruiter and maybe the recruiter wrote it on the contract, but you want to talk to the person who's your direct supervisor at your job, who's making the schedule for your facility. Look ahead on your schedule once you actually start working, and look at the calendar and see if they have you on the calendar to work those days. This is really easy to see if it's like an outpatient facility. It might not be as easy to see in advance for an inpatient facility, but just follow up with the manager and say, oh, when I signed my contract, I requested these dates off. Make sure they know that, because I didn't realize at that time, I guess that maybe whoever's up here and whoever's up here with the recruiting company and the regional manager or whatever agreed to it, but my direct supervisor had no idea.
Yeah.
So definitely check those things out.
Yeah, and it seems crazy, but there are situations like that where the hiring manager may never see this contract. So yeah, bring that stuff up with them.
Yep. Before we keep going, just a quick shout out to everybody that's watching live. Again, thank you for joining us. I see Leona came on, Victoria, John, Blake, Amy, Lisa. Thank you guys, Ashley, Erica, Rosa. Thank you guys so much for joining. Again, if you're watching live, we would love if you would leave a comment. If you're watching later on the replay, put #replay. And we'd also appreciate if you would give us a thumbs up on the video on whatever platform that you are watching on. We really appreciate that support. Okay, so moving forward, as we're discussing all these things, like Jared said earlier, a lot of people will reach out to us and they'll ask us to look over their contracts for them. We're happy to look over your contracts for you if you want help with that. And we can help you kind of understand your first contract to see if it's a good situation or not. But we're hoping that by doing this video and empowering you guys to understand all the things that we look at when we get a contract, that way you'll know going forward, you can look at your own contracts and say, okay, Whitney and Jared said to check for this and check for this and check for this. And that's where the article that we've written on traveltherapymentor.com will really help you as kind of a checklist guide of what to go through each and every contract. And sometimes I even go back and reference that article when we start a new contract, because it will have been a little while since we signed a contract, and I'll be like, oh yeah, what do I have this, and this in there to make sure that all those boxes are checked.
Yeah, it's never a bad idea on your first contract to have an experienced person look over it. We've probably looked at several hundred of them over the last couple of years, just checking over, making sure everything looks normal. And usually it's about pay. That's usually why people reach out to us. They say, like, does this pay look normal for this contract? And the more that you can double check things and go into it informed, the better.
Yeah. So the next thing we've talked about start and end dates and dates off that you've requested. Sometimes on your contract, it will actually specifically state your schedule, but not always. But it usually will at least say something about like whether or not you're going to typically be working Mondays through Fridays, or whether you're expected to work weekends. So look for that on your contract to see whether it specifically states your schedule. It may or may not always state your hours, like 9 to 5 or whatever it is, but look and see if that's on there. And look and see if it's really important to you, whether or not it says if you're required to work weekends or not. Might be something you want to get written into there if you're really trying to avoid being obligated to work weekends. Or it might say something like if you work on a rotation where it says weekends as needed, or 1 weekend a month or something like that.
Yep. The next thing is guaranteed or expected hours will usually be on there if those things are included in this contract. So we talked about last week how guaranteed hours are less common now, but if there are any guaranteed hours on the contract, that should be in there, and that should be something that you already talked to the recruiter about beforehand. negotiated about that if possible to get guaranteed hours in the contract.
Yeah. And the difference between guaranteed and expected hours are maybe you're normally expected to work 40 hours a week. You're expected to have a full 40-hour work week. So if they request for you to work 5 8-hour days, that would be normal. So it might say expected hours 40, but they might only guarantee that they can give you 32 or 36. So you might have two different things there where one says expected hours and one says guaranteed hours.
Yeah, and that's important. The expectation is no guarantee. So if it just says expected hours, 40 hours a week, that does not mean that you're going to get paid 40 hours a week no matter what.
So really important to understand the difference in that terminology and look for that when you see your contract. Now, sometimes I've seen that they will put productivity expectation on there, but sometimes they don't. And we've had travelers, especially new travelers, come to us and say, do I need to make sure that they write my productivity expectation in there so there's no question about it? This is kind of a gray area, and in some cases we would kind of rather that they didn't put a productivity expectation on there, especially if it's something like a skilled nursing facility, because if they put, for example, 90% productivity expectation on there and then you sign it, then they might come back and really hold you strongly to that and say, look, you signed a contract that said you were going to meet this 90% productivity, and then you get to the job and you find out that's not really realistic. That could really put you in a bind.
Yeah, and there are situations too, and when that happens, that the facility will actually reduce your pay based on how far away you are from that productivity. So for example, if you sign a contract that says 90% and you're only at 84, they might prorate your pay based on a lower productivity expectation. So even though it seems like it might be a good idea to have that included in the contract, yeah, generally, especially if it's a high expectation, you don't really want that in there because there's all kinds of repercussions that can happen from that.
Personally, we would never sign a contract where it says that they can reduce your pay based on the productivity. So if I ever saw that in a contract, I would probably ask for it to be removed. Otherwise, I wouldn't accept the contract. If it says something to the effect of pay will be reduced based on not meeting productivity, I would never sign a contract that says that. Now, somewhere that we've had therapists to reach out to us before where they might be interested in having their productivity written in is like an outpatient facility for physical therapists. If they've agreed that they're only going to give you 8 to 12 patients a day and you're like, yes, like I really want to make sure I only get 8 to 12 patients a day, because if they start loading me up more than that, then that's not okay. So then you might want it written in there so that you can come back and say, look, you told me you were only going to make me see 8 to 12 patients a day, and it didn't say anywhere in there about double booking. That might be a situation in which you'd like to have it in there. But again, they don't always put it on there, so you may just want to make sure you have that communication documented elsewhere, like an email exchange, or just make sure that it's followed up with your recruiter, that they understand that that was also the expectation. So if it ever becomes an issue, it's not just something that you talked about with the manager that they can deny.
As we're going through this, if there's anything we say that's unclear or you have any questions about anything, feel free to ask those in the comments, and at the end we'll go back through all the comments.
Absolutely. Okay, so productivity may or may not be on there. We talked about guaranteed and expected hours. Now the next part that you want to look for in your contract is the cancellation policy. So let's explain a little bit about what the cancellation policy is.
Yeah, so normally I would guess the standard is probably a 14-day cancellation on most travel contracts. So if nothing is discussed, the recruiter doesn't say anything to you, a lot of times it's just understood to be 14 days. But usually it will be written in the contract. We almost always push for a 30-day cancellation notice if at all possible. The reason for that being, if you have your contract canceled, that gives you more time to figure out what the next move is. Are you going to find another job in the area? Are you going to be able to get out of your lease? Is there something else that fits you better across the country? And you have time to get all that stuff figured out. 14 days is a real rush if you have your contract ended and then you have to find something very quickly while working that 2 weeks. So that will usually be included in the contract. If it's not, then clarify that. Is it 14 days? Is it 30 days? We've seen some cases where they put in there 7 days or no notice. Mm-hmm. So try to make sure that you're getting at least 14 days, ideally 30-day cancellation notice in your contract.
And if you're new to this and you don't know what a cancellation policy is, it's the opportunity for you to put in your notice to say that you're going to leave for one reason or another, or it's the opportunity for them to cancel your contract if something comes up. So it goes both ways. If it's you that needs to cancel the contract because, for example, it's just an awful situation and you want to get out of there, in that case, having only to be responsible for giving them a 14-day notice is actually in your favor. But if it happens the other way, where they cancel you because maybe they hired somebody permanently or some other reason, it's in your benefit to get the 30 days. So it's a little bit tricky there. I mean, we've only ever had one contract where one of us was canceled because they hired somebody and we had a 30-day, and that was really helpful. Other than that, it's never really been an issue for us. So it doesn't happen that often, but try to always ask. If it's not written in there, be sure you know, so you kind of know going in what it's going to be.
Yeah, and for the most part, it's much more rare that a traveler is ending a contract early than the facility is ending a contract early. So because of that, usually the longer the cancellation policy, the better.
Absolutely. So the next part would be looking at your pay rate. And there's a few things that you're going to see on your written contract in regard to your pay rate. So this, like Jared said earlier, you would have already discussed this verbally, or hopefully maybe had an email exchange with your recruiter breaking down what your pay is going to be. Usually they'll show you the pay package before you ever sign the written contract, so you have a chance to ask questions and negotiate a little bit. But typically your pay rate in the written contract is broken down into your hourly pay and then your per diems or your stipends. So it'll say hourly, it'll say per diems for your housing, and then per diems for your meals and incidentals.
Yeah, and sometimes the wording can be weird. We just had someone send us a contract probably earlier this week, I guess, and it had something in there where it was like taxable portion of pay, and then it said, I think it said subsidy, and then per diem. And they were very confused about that. And basically the subsidy that the contract was referring to, I figured out, was housing subsidy. So they obviously weren't taking taking housing through the travel company. So the travel company was giving them a per diem for housing, but they were calling it a subsidy. So the wording can be different. It can be stipend, per diem, subsidy, but all those things pretty much mean the same thing.
We've also seen them break it down differently. So typically your hourly is just always going to be listed as a typical hourly taxable rate. And that might be somewhere between like $15 and $25 an hour. Now the per diem, sometimes they list it on an hourly basis, in which case you would multiply it out by 40 the same way you would your regular hourly pay. But sometimes they'll list per diems as just a weekly number. And that's how we've typically seen it, is it'll just be like, $760 per week plus $340 per week equals $1,100, per week for your total stipend. Now, this kind of goes beyond the scope of tonight's video. If you're not sure exactly how the pay breakdown works, I would highly encourage you to go back and read some of our articles about pay or our videos about pay, so you can better understand how those pay rates are broken down and how it kind of all adds together to get your weekly take-home number. But this is usually how it's going to be written in your contract. You're going to see those 3 separate numbers.
Yep. So no matter how they word it or how they break it down, just realize the easiest way to do it is to get it into a weekly number, multiplying out the per diem or the stipends, and then taking taxes out of the taxable pay, and then getting that into a weekly take-home number. That's usually how things are talked about in travel world, and it's the most uniform way to do it.
Yeah. So with that said, you want to double check that what is written on the contract adds up. You want to run the numbers yourself. This can be one of the hardest parts of being a new traveler and trying to figure out, when they present you with this pay package, how to run the numbers yourself. This is where it's going to really benefit you to go back and look at some of our old videos and old articles about pay, so you can sit down and actually crunch the numbers yourself and make sure it comes out to be what they said it was going to be. There's an easy way to just like back of the envelope do this, where we would just multiply the hourly rate by 40 hours and then multiply it by about 0.75, take about 25%-ish taxes out, and then add that number to the other numbers to make a weekly after-tax pay. If you want to be a little more precise, you can use a website called paycheckcity.com. and it's actually going to calculate your taxes exactly right for you based on your state and how you file your taxes. So if you want to be really precise, you can use that website, or if you want to just do it kind of back of the envelope to give a ballpark idea, that's okay too. The other thing you would want to think about, and then we kind of used to look at this more, we haven't looked at it as much lately with our own contracts. There's a website called the GSA website. The GSA website tells you what the per diems or what the stipends are allowed to be based on the city and state in which you're going to be working. And this is usually what the travel therapy companies use to calculate how much per diem they're allowed to pay you for your housing and your meals and incidentals.
Yeah, it's important to mention there that that is the maximum they are allowed to pay you, not what they will pay you. So a lot of people will reach out to us. They've looked up the GSA numbers for their contract. They see the per diems are not as high as what the GSA number shows, and they wonder why that is. And the reason for that is because the pay package is not high enough to support that. So the bill rate that is offered by the facility to the travel company isn't high enough to max that out. That's a common occurrence, especially in some of the places on the East Coast or middle of the country where pay rates might be a little lower. There are situations where the GSA might be maxed out, and in which case they might shift some of that pay to increased taxable pay. But yes, you can use the GSA to figure out what the maximum will be for an area, but that doesn't mean that's what they're going to give you for that area.
Yeah. Again, a little bit, some of this is like pretty complicated. If you're a newer traveler, I probably wouldn't worry too much about the GSA. If you're somebody who's more experienced as a traveler, you're trying to better understand the way that pay works, you've already learned the basics of how pay works, then you might dig a little deeper into understanding these numbers and double checking them. But for the most part, the travel therapy company is going to follow the GSA guidelines because they don't want to get in trouble with the IRS either. So they're going to follow those guidelines and stay within them. So mainly you just want to make sure that when you run the numbers and subtract out your taxes, that the take-home number is acceptable to you and it's what was discussed. Because you definitely don't want them to have made a typo on your contract and then payroll is going to pay you based on that. And then it's like 2 weeks later when you get your first paycheck and you've already put in 2 weeks of work at this facility only to find out that your take-home pay is not what you expected it to be in your phone call.
Very true.
All right, so in addition to your hourly and your per diems, they may or may not put overtime rate on your contracts.
Yeah, and the overtime rate, there's almost never a situation where you shouldn't have that written in. There are tons of times where the recruiter and the hiring manager will assure you that overtime, you're not going to get overtime with this contract. But we've had situations several times where they told us we wouldn't get overtime, and then something happens, they lose staff, the census increases or something like that, and we do end up getting overtime. So having a rate written in there and agreed upon is important. And usually the default rate is just time and a half on your taxable pay, which is not high enough. You need to either agree to two times hourly pay or higher than that to make overtime worth it for you as a traveler. A lot of companies will allow you to basically negotiate for, say, a rate like $60 an hour for overtime, like some flat rate that is, several times higher than your taxable rate. But you need to have that written in there and then agree to it with the recruiter and, sign it all and make it official.
We have worked with one company, it's one of the bigger travel therapy companies that doesn't typically write overtime rate into their contract. And we've had to go back several times to discuss this with our recruiter and or the manager to make sure that it is spelled out one way or another, whether they're able to write it specifically in your contract or whether they have to do some type of addendum to the contract, or whether you have a formal email exchange that states if you were to work overtime, it would be paid at this rate. It needs to be written in there somehow, some way. So don't, if you think there's any possibility that you could potentially work overtime at a contract, always try to get that written in one way or the other and discussed before moving forward, because the last thing you want to do is find out that you end up working overtime and you're only getting paid time and a half on that hourly number. That's way too low. Yeah.
Our minimum over the last few years, we messed up this a ton in the beginning, our first couple of years when we didn't know as much, but our minimum now for the last several years has been $45 an hour, but ideally even more than that for overtime.
Okay. So sometimes they will or will not have the overtime rate in there. Sometimes they will or will not have a holiday rate written in there. This is mainly just important if your contract is going to run through some major holidays in which you think you may have to work those holidays. If that is the case, like right now, if you take a contract at the end of the year where you run through some major holidays and you know that like it's an inpatient facility and they might ask you to work the holiday, you definitely want to make sure a holiday rate is written in there. And again, this should also be more than just time and a half on your hourly. It should be higher rate than that.
Yeah, you do have to remember though with the holiday rate that if it's part of the 40-hour work week, you're also going to be getting stipends for that for those hours worked. So you don't need a huge rate there. Depending, I mean, you can always try to negotiate for higher, but 1.5 or 2 times hourly rate is not as unreasonable as it would be for something like overtime.
Yeah, and if that's confusing and you don't understand why the overtime rate should be higher, we have a separate video and article on that where you can kind of delve deeper into understanding how overtime works as a travel therapist. Okay, so you're going to look for under your pay section, your hourly, your per diems for your meals, housing, and incidentals. Look for an overtime rate, look for a holiday rate. You also want to see if there's any clause written in there about reduced pay if you don't get your full hours. You want to see if they're going to adjust your pay if you're not able to work a full week.
Yeah, and obviously they're going to adjust your hourly pay. If you don't have guaranteed hours, they're going to adjust the hourly pay if you don't work the full hours. But what needs to be written in there is, are they going to adjust stipends and per diems if you don't work the full time? There are some companies that will pay you the per diems, the stipends, the full amount whether you work 40 hours or not, even if you don't have that guarantee in your contract. And there are other ones that will prorate it based on how many hours you actually work. So knowing that going into it is very important.
Yeah. If you're watching this video and a lot of this sounds really complicated, don't worry, it's really not that complicated. To be honest, travel therapy contracts are usually just 1 page, maybe at maximum 2 pages. It's not a long document. It's not some lengthy 30-page thing that you're never going to possibly read. It's literally 1 or 2 pages. So you do want to make sure that you read it line for line. And if it's your first time taking a contract, or if it's your first time working with that travel therapy company, you really do want to read it line for line and make sure you understand everything that you're agreeing to, because an unfortunate thing that can happen is you might come to expect what company A does and it might be different than what company B does, and you can take that for granted sometimes. So like Jared was just saying, sometimes certain companies will guarantee stipends, which means even if you only work, say, 32 hours, they'll still give you 100% of your stipends, which is amazing because that's like a huge chunk of your pay. But there are certain companies that will prorate your stipends as well as your hourly. And it's really important to know what you're getting into going into it so that you're not hurt on your weekly paycheck at the end if you don't end up getting 40 hours. There's nothing worse than thinking you're going to get paid all this money and then not getting paid it. So really make sure to read that part of the contract very thoroughly.
Yep. Another thing that's on pretty much every contract is going to be any sort of reimbursements that you've agreed upon or that the company is willing to offer. So things like license reimbursement, if you have to pay out of pocket for things like drug test, physical, background check, usually they'll reimburse for that. Travel to and from the assignment. So they'll usually pay a mileage amount based on how far you have to drive to the assignment and back. That may be included on there. What else?
Yeah, so mainly just the license, the travel, the credentialing. That's something else I think that some companies you can take for granted. So some companies will pay for all your credentialing fees, like if you have to get a drug test or a physical or that sort of thing, but we have run into some companies that do not pay that. So you want to make sure to find that out beforehand, because we took that for granted with one company that we worked with. We went to another company and we were like, I had to pay this $100 to go get my drug test and my physical and all this stuff, and that was kind of annoying. Yeah. So you want to find out if any type of reimbursement was discussed, if it's written in there, or just know what's expected of you. You also want to know every now and then they'll write in the contract specifically whether or not you're going to accept their company insurance. They don't always write it in the contracts, but sometimes they do. And especially if you're a first-time traveler or you're a first-time with this company traveler, find out if your weekly pay rates are being quoted before or after your insurance deduction.
Yeah, there are situations where it won't matter as much. Insurance rates have obviously increased a lot since we started. Every year they're going up, But when we first started, we were paying, I had a catastrophic plan that I was paying like $12 a week. So obviously that didn't affect my pay very much, but if you're in a situation where maybe it's you plus a spouse or a spouse and kids, then that obviously makes a huge difference if you're talking about pay before or after insurance.
I would say the majority of the time your recruiter is going to quote your pay before insurance, and that kind of ticks some people off if they don't understand that for the first time. They're like, oh, well, my pay was a lot different when I got my paycheck. And it's like, well, yeah, because your insurance came out. They don't always quote it that way, but if it's important to you to know exactly what it's going to be before or after insurance, make sure to look at it that way. See if it's written on your contract and see if you can clarify with the recruiter, is this before or after insurance, just to kind of curb your expectations there.
Yeah, and it's not because the recruiters, usually it's not because they're trying to take advantage of you with giving you a pre-insurance number. It's because they don't know what you're going to choose for your insurance, obviously. Usually they have multiple plans, and you can either have spouse or dependents on there or not, so they don't know. So they're giving you that number before any deductions like that.
So just look on your contract, see whether or not it says anything about you accepting or declining the insurance, see whether or not it says the rate that the insurance is going to cost or not. It's not a huge deal if it's not on there, but you just may want to ask those questions so you can better understand what you're getting into. It may or may not say anything about your 401k eligibility on there as well. Again, that might be something that's just separately listed in their benefits package that you'll discuss later, but just look on your contract to see if there's anything about whether or not you're eligible for their 401k and about that enrollment.
Yeah, every company's different there. You might be eligible day one, you might be eligible at the beginning of the next year, you might be eligible after a 3-month contract. So all of them are different, and then also their matching terms are all different as well. So something to either read the benefit guide or ask your recruiter about.
Yep. So I think that we've covered everything that's normally in a contract, as well as a few things that are sometimes in a written contract and sometimes not. As we kind of discussed here, if there's something that's not written in the contract that you're expecting to see that we talked about here, ask your recruiter about it. Sometimes they'll tell you, you know what, at our company we don't write that specifically in the contract. Most of the time that's okay if it's not written there, but if you feel like it's something really life-altering, that if you don't have it in there, it's going to put you at some kind of risk, then you might push a little harder and say, I would really like for this to be changed. I would like for it to be added in the contract, especially if it has to do with your pay, with your dates off, and those really important factors. If it's something a little bit more vague, like benefits, productivity, might not be that important to have it written in the contract, but it would be good if you at least have an email exchange where it's written down that you could reference back to if it ever became an issue.
Yeah, I would say the biggest things, dates you need off, so dates for a starting end date, dates you need off, pay, overtime rates, guaranteed hours, and cancellation. Those are probably the biggest thing to make sure that's all in there and correct. Other things are not as important usually, but if they are important to you, then definitely clarify with the recruiter.
Yeah, and if your recruiter doesn't know the answer, it's a good idea, I think, when you're first starting with a recruiter or a company, to build a relationship with the manager of your recruiter, because sometimes there are questions that your recruiter may or may not be able to answer for you, but if you're able to talk to the manager above them, it's good to have their contact information, because sometimes they have more power to make things happen than a recruiter does. So never a bad idea to ask to speak with the manager. Not in a like, can I speak to the manager, tough guy kind of way, but just to know, because sometimes they have more power to move things around and change things than the recruiter does.
Yeah, you always do your best to resolve things with the recruiter first, but yeah, I mean, it's not a bad thing to have their information.
As we mentioned before, we are willing to take a look at your contracts for you. So if you're listening to this or watching this video and you're interested in having us look at a travel therapy contract for you, we're happy to do that for you. Usually what I'll do is we'll go and look through the contract, and we'll, instead of just saying, yeah, looks good or looks bad, we'll explain to you step by step, kind of like, these are the things that I looked at, this, and this look good, but this, and this you might want to ask about. So that way we're kind of empowering you and educating you on how to do it next time. So next time you get a contract, you can look at it yourself and know what to look for. Because that's really important about, our mentorship and our education is teaching you guys how you can go forth and do this on your own without our guidance.
Yeah, our main goal is to have you guys not make the same mistakes we made when we started.
Yeah. And in addition to that, we've gotten some questions before about whether or not we charge for these services, like looking over your contracts, giving you advice, giving you mentorship. As of right now, all of the content and all of the mentorship and education that we put out is free. We don't have any charge for that. So a lot of people ask, how do we make money? So full disclosure, the way that we are able to earn any kind of income from our website and our blog and our mentorship is if you decide to work with one of the recruiters that we recommend, we would get a referral bonus. Just like if any of your friends or another travel therapist, if you go in a travel therapy group and say, hey, do you guys have any recruiters that you like? If they refer you to their recruiter, they would also get a referral bonus. So that's the only way that we make money off of anything that we do. If you don't work with any of the recruiters that we recommend, it's no big deal. We still put out a ton of free educational content and mentorship. We're happy to answer any questions for free. We don't have any charge for that at this time. But if you are looking for any ways to give back, if you've appreciated any of the content that we've put out, any of our free articles, our free videos, our free one-on-one chats and emails back and forth, we would love if you would leave a review on our Facebook page just as a way to say thank you and kind of spread the word. We'd also love if you would just share our content with other people that are interested in travel. We also enjoy comments and likes on all of our social media platforms. We are on Facebook, we're on Instagram, YouTube, and podcast. We have, like we like to say, there's a movie quote, we have all the Twitters, except we actually don't use Twitter. But that's just a little bit of information if you guys are looking for ways to give back other than monetarily to all the free education and content that we put out.
Yeah, so if you guys have any questions, we'll go through some of the questions and comments now. Feel free to leave those.
Yeah, so if you're watching live and you have a question, just put it below in the comments. We'll go through the ones that we have now. If you're watching later on the replay, you can also feel free to leave a comment and we'll answer it later.
So Blake says, is it possible or likely to renegotiate overtime pay after already signing and starting a contract? It's possible. We've done it before, but I would not say it's likely. So normally once you sign the contract, they might be willing to help you out just to be nice, but they don't have any obligation to change any of the pay structure after you sign it. So that's why it's always vital to get that in there before you sign. But it never hurts to reach out and ask, hey, especially if you're already starting to work overtime. If you're not working overtime, it might not be a big deal at all. So maybe don't even worry about it. But if you start to work overtime, then it might be a good idea to just ask and try to get that rate increased.
And Jared had this happen before we really realized about the overtime rate and how we were really getting underpaid for it if we just took the time and a half. He had a contract where he was working a lot of overtime, so we went back to our recruiter, and I think we ended up talking to the manager because again, it wasn't something that they had really the ability to just change in their contract the way it was currently written. So we talked to them and said, hey, you know what, we're working all these overtime hours and you guys are really benefiting from it too because you're probably charging the facility time and a half on the entire bill rate and yet you're only paying us time and a half on the hourly rate. So you're really benefiting and making all this extra money and we're not making enough money. And because we had a good relationship with them, they did do something to increase that rate. They weren't really able to go back and exactly change how they're charging it on his weekly pay, but what they did was they negotiated a reimbursement in the amount to make up for all the hours.
It wasn't a reimbursement, it was a bonus. At the end of the contract, they agreed to go back and look at all the hours that I worked overtime and then paid me a bonus amount per hour. So there are situations where they'll understand. I mean, if they're getting paid time and a half and you're getting paid time and a half for your taxable portion, that might be the difference between you getting paid $30 an hour for overtime and them getting paid $100 an hour. And basically when we talked to the manager about that, they were like, oh yeah, that's not really fair. We'll fix this for you. So never hurts to ask.
Nick says the dream contract is a contract where there is 0% productivity.
Yeah, for sure.
That is true. Hi, Leona. Leona says, thanks. I came in late. I'll watch the rest later. Thank you, Leona.
Blake said he's starting his first contract next week.
Congrats,
so I guess that's tomorrow. So that's awesome.
Congratulations, Blake. I hope it goes well. So we'll see if we have any other questions. Oh, Nick doesn't have a question, but he says, I saw that you both shot guns this weekend. I shot a .357 Magnum and an AR-15 for the first time ever 2 days ago. It was a good way to relieve stress.
Yeah, so Nick saw our post on Instagram probably. We went to the shooting range a couple days ago. Whitney's first time ever ever shooting a gun, really.
Well, I've shot a gun a couple times, but that was the first time shooting at a shooting range. It was very interesting. It was a little bit nerve-wracking, but I felt a little more confident and a little less scared of holding a gun. So it was an interesting experience.
Yeah.
So we'll see if we have any other questions. Again, if you're watching live, feel free to leave a question in the comments. If you're watching later on the replay, we'll go back and answer any questions that you have. Leona says, PT here. I've heard that it's better to apply for licensing in other states on your own versus going through the travel agency, particularly for states that aren't in the compact. Can you explain why or why not, and how would it make it easier?
So applying to states on your own, for the most part, you're always going to have to apply for states on your own. There are situations where the agency might be able to help you out with some of the paperwork. But yeah, I mean, almost always you're going to be the one that's going through the process. If they'll help you, that's always a benefit.
Mm-hmm.
But there usually aren't many situations where I would say the company would do it for you.
Yeah, I don't really know that that's true the way that you stated it specifically, that it would be better to apply for the licensing. If you have the option, it's actually better to let the company do it for you because it takes a lot of the work off your plate. But unfortunately, a lot of the times you do not have that option. The only time that we've ever had a travel therapy company help us with a license was when we were already an established traveler on contract with them in a certain state, and then we were looking for our job in the next state, and they helped us work on a future license for that next state because we were currently employed by them. If you're a new traveler and you're not currently employed by any travel company because you're not on a contract, they're most likely not going to help you because it requires them putting in time, effort, and money to help you with a future license, and they're not going to invest that money in you if you're not working for them.
Yeah, if they're willing to help you, though, I would never turn down the help. I can't think of any reason why you wouldn't want them to help you.
Yeah, but under most circumstances, unfortunately, you are going to have to apply on your own. And I know it seems like a lot of hassle, and I think that because as physical therapists, we have the benefit of the PT compact now for some states, we think of it like that's the end-all be-all, but unfortunately, for the majority of time, it's always been that you had to apply for your own licenses. The PT compact is very new. It's only eligible for certain PTs whose home states are participating. So every other PT out there who's not eligible, plus every OT, plus every SLP, plus most other disciplines are always going to have to apply for licenses on their own. So it's just kind of how it is. It's not that big of a deal. We've done it for years.
Yeah.
We've applied for 5 or 6 or 7 licenses and never used the PT compact yet. So it's not a huge deal. Most of the time you'll do it on your own.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's a little bit of hassle, but it's not so bad.
Yep. So if there are any other questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. If not, we'll wrap up for tonight. As we mentioned, if you guys got any benefit out of this video, we'd love if you would give us a thumbs up. We'd love if you'd subscribe on whichever platform you prefer. And if you're looking for any ways to give back to our content, to the mentorship that we provide, we would love if you'd leave us a review either on our Facebook page or on our podcast. If you like to listen like on Apple Podcasts, you can leave a review there. We really appreciate any positive feedback you guys can give us, and we really appreciate your support as well.
Yep, and if you have any suggestions for videos, feel free to send us those as well.
Yeah, and like we mentioned, if you would like for us to look over a travel therapy contract for you, or if you would like to ask us any questions about like your pay rate, like your pay package breakdown, feel free to either email us, traveltherapymentor@gmail.com, with the details, and we'll look over it and send it back to you, or you can send it to us on our Facebook via Messenger.
Yep. All right, thanks guys. We'll see you next week.
All right, have a good night.
Bye.